Victoria 3's major patch 1.1 is on the way, and last week we talked about changes to government legitimacy and the needs of our populations, some vital improvements to the user interface at the very least. Now we know more about resources like oil and also some changes to production methods, buildings, and more. So do join us and subscribe. I'll keep making these updates so long as you enjoy watching them. And let's jump straight in. And first and foremost, I think that we should just put what we're discussing in context quickly. As a reminder, patch 1.1, the patch we're discussing today, will focus on game polish, bug fixing, balancing, AI improvements, and the user interface. It is this patch that will be releasing actually very soon, probably within the next 4 weeks. They've said it will release before the end of the year. So everything that we're discussing today falls within that. Then there'll be a future patch next year, the 1.2 version, that will make wider changes to some things we've discussed here on the channel, like warfare and diplomacy. With that to one side, let's jump in and talk about the changes coming very soon and the new ones that they revealed this morning. We're going to start by taking a look at a map, not a graph this time. This is the oil extraction discoverability map. As the current version of the game stipulates it, you can see that oil is refined, pun intended, to a few territories on the map with high concentration. Now, part of the problem here is around late game bottlenecking, and as they discuss in the developer diary, in the current version of the game, oil reserves are discoverable, again, in those concentrated areas. They are mostly the historical oil fields that were cultivated over current knowledge of oil is and how accessible, even if we didn't necessarily know about it until after Victoria 3 ends in 1936. As a little side note here, we'll talk more about historical accuracy a little later on. As they go on to say though, in the late game, oil is scarce and resource limits progress late game industrialization. While we want oil to be an important late game resource, its bottleneck as an available resource is too harsh on the player's experience. To get around this, they've expanded the discoverability of oil to make it more available across a wider variety of territories, while still holding, broadly speaking, to the historical accuracy and the general locations from the previous map. Now, let's do a little comparison. Here is the current oil extraction in Victoria 3, and as we transition through to the new version, you'll see it span out, generally in lower quantities, 5s and 10s, but, broadly speaking, it's more accessible. Now, this might bring into question, well, this is a historical simulator. What do you mean? Through their consultation, they address many of these questions. Oil production methods are already incredibly profitable, and buffing them further would help out, but probably not fully solve the problem. This is justification for why they need to span it out wider. They go on to say that some other interventions simply don't quite work as intended. The gating of oil fields to only historically extracted areas, Russia, the United States, can be difficult. If they collapse in game, 50% of the world's supply is locked, and your game is essentially ruined and unplayable potentially from that point, or at least it could be. They say we want to have historical credibility, but also give players multiple avenues to pursue, slightly more flexibility, I would argue, on the map. Lastly, they say we don't exactly leave a track record of this field would have been accessible in 1880 in our history books, so it can be difficult to align it, and it's often guesstimate work on where or when exactly these historical oil fields were discovered. The extraction, of course, we likely have better records around. The point here is that they are vying for historical accuracy still, but trying to provide a little bit more flexibility to the player. Now, oil isn't done with yet. There are more changes that they'd like to add in future, but before I talk about further down the line, we should really address what's coming in patch 1.1, and oil's friend rubber is next on the list. Here is a map of the world's discoverable rubber supply as of the current patch, 1.0.6. And while rubber is not as much of a bottleneck to global supply in the late game, it's found to generally be plentiful enough to meet world demand. As they make the AI better at extracting it, though, they have no doubt they'll need to increase the supply. So here is a new map. Did you notice the change? Let me swap back to the old one. And now the new one. One more time, eagle-eyed viewers. Here is the old, and here is the new. Oh, they got us. They got us good. That's right, everybody. It was a troll move the whole time, but one with some rationale behind it. They're going to say, notice the difference? No, your eyes aren't deceiving you. It's exactly the same, and that's intentional. The changes to rubber have been focused on its vertical margins, i.e. producing more in the same place, as opposed to its horizontal margins, i.e. spreading out across the map, having supply reach further out. While I could have upped the world supply of rubber, looking at the later game save files, I found it was population issues which were preventing the resource from meeting the demands, the developers say. Now, as we move through a little further then, how do you plan to fix it? What they did instead was add a new production method, PM, to the rubber plantations. This gave them an automatic irrigation system, like that of other plantations that the buildings share by name only in the game, to symbolize later efforts to modernize them by essentially replacing human beings with machines. This is a familiar theory and trend throughout history, of course, and it will ultimately increase the productivity of the buildings in the game. And they give us a little sneak peek at it here as well. You can see the production method alongside the basic production, now automatic irrigation, and you can see the impacts that that's having as well on employment, decreasing it for laborers, increasing it for machinists and farmers, and goods consumption and produced, of course. Loads more rubber, plus 30. A few more engines will go into that process as well. There are future changes coming to these resources though. They're not done yet. And the irony of cutting New Zealand off of all these maps throughout the video hasn't escaped me as a New Zealander, but on the topic of oil, there are future changes that will be coming. It's not just as simple as scaling it up. They include potentially gating some oil reserve potential behind a technology, where deposits that were not found until more modern days are harder for the player to get access to. Oil supply is in short demand. They might look to add more variation of production methods, like we just talked about with rubber, input and output balancing of those factories, and finally, giving the whale oil industry a bit more of a kick into gear in the early stages of the game. Other levers that they're thinking about pulling to tinker with that resource. Rubber as well, hardly know her. Here's the discoverable map yet again. Of course, that remains unchanged. Instead, it's the production methods. There are more things that they could look to do in future here. They highlight these three. Adding more rubber potential to the world if these changes aren't enough. Potentially synthesizing rubber in the late game. And state traits for specific areas of the world best suited to cultivate rubber. Maybe they provide a production bonus or greater supply. Whatever that may be. It's traits assigned to certain territories. A theme throughout the whole thing, by the way, was that all of the changes have been vetted and tested, or need to be, against their quality assurance team. And they also make a specific point of mentioning that they've gathered a lot of thoughts from Discord and forums, and that we should keep those coming, and that is great to see. Last but not least then, what's to expect next? Well, as I discussed at the start of the video, all of the changes, including the ones that we talked about last week, things like the goods needs of a population, legitimacy of a government, and the changes that we discussed this week to oil supply, rubber, and production methods, will be rolling out before the end of the year. And considering at the time of recording this, it's currently the 18th of November, because I'm living one day in the future. Happy Friday, everybody. It's not that far away, probably only a few weeks. Next week, they'll be sharing more changes coming to patch 1.1, and I'll be sharing them here with you on my Friday morning. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you then. Take care, and bye-bye.